Hey, I'm back, and back in the living room again. Uh, this is Jeff again, and I wanted to come back and talk to you about something I mentioned in the video yesterday when I asked the question, did Judas go to hell? And I wanted to come back and tell you about when I was reading from John chapter 17, verse 2, where Jesus was praying. Jesus was actually talking about himself in the third person when he was speaking to the Father. And I pointed out that he often did that throughout the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's really noticeable, especially when he talks about the Son of Man shall do this and the Son of Man shall do that. And I said that there was a lot of meaning to that, and I wanted to explain how I've come to see this. And it all starts with a verse that I used to think about for a long time, ever since, pretty much my teenage years, all the way up into my 40s, actually. And I wouldn't think about it all the time, but I'd often wonder about it. And the verse is John 14, verse 12, and it says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believeth on me, the works that I do shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do, because I go to my Father." And I always wondered every once in a while, whenever I'd think of that verse, it's like, you know what? I'm a believer. I've believed in Jesus all my life. And what are these greater works that I'm going to do? Because I haven't healed the sick, and I haven't raised the dead, and even though I might act like it, I have not walked on water. And I got thinking about it a little more, and this is just a few years ago, and I decided to read it again, because the day I was thinking about it, I also thought about the fact that, well, the only two I remember in the entire New Testament who even did anything like what Jesus did were Peter and Paul. Both of them are reported to have healed the sick, and both of them are reported to have raised the dead. But even then, they aren't greater works. And not only that, they didn't do even as great as Jesus, because they didn't raise themselves from the dead. So, huge feats if I'm supposed to be the believer that's going to do the greater works. So, am I the believer? Are you the believer that Jesus is talking about in John chapter 14, verse 12? It's interesting that in my King James Version, it's the part where it says, "He that believeth on me." I think that's a typo. It's capitalized, but the rest of the he's aren't, so it's probably just a typo. But the he stood out to me when I read it a few years ago. I decided to sit down and read that verse again, and I read it over a couple of times. And I kept noticing it says, "He that believes on me, greater works shall he do." And I'm like, he. Jesus is not saying they who believe on me, greater works shall they do. He's saying he, and I just noticed that he's saying he, and that's singular. And it may or may not be important, but I took note of that. And then I read on, and he says, "Because I go unto my Father." Well, we all know that Jesus went to his Father after he resurrected from the dead. And Jesus said to Mary that he went to his father. He had to go to his Father first because he's not yet been glorified. So, at least that's the way I remember it being said. But we do know that he went to the Father. Now, this was after the resurrection. So, when he went to the Father, what happened? He went to the Father as the risen Lamb of God. He himself presented himself to God, the worthy one, the sacrifice, the Lamb, his blood, which redeemed the entire world. And then God, therefore, said, "He is Lord," and God the Father took everyone into his house. Jesus actually presented Adam, the last Adam. He presented the entire human race to the Father, righteous in him, sacrifice complete, judgment finished. Who did the greater works? God. Who believed in Jesus? God. He's the believer. And so I was like, oh my gosh, Jesus is talking about himself, and he's talking about the Father. He's talking about God. Now, when I realized that, I was like, oh my God, greater works have already been done. That believer is here, but I'm not that believer. So the question now is, was Jesus talked about himself a lot, and I wonder why. Yesterday I pointed out that we know that no one believed, and that's because God chose to blind their eyes and stop up their ears. Well, what do you think one way of doing that would be? And is it possible people's eyes are still being blinded and their ears are still being stopped up, but it's not because of what God's doing anymore, but it's because of how God once spoke? If Jesus talks about himself a lot in the third person, a lot of times we have a tendency, and if he's doing it on purpose without for a reason, for example, so people, though hearing, may not hear, and though seeing, may not see. I got to thinking about another verse. I read another verse one day. Somebody brought it up to me. And it was in Matthew chapter 16, verse 27. And he's talking about himself again. And it says, "For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father and his angels. And then he shall reward every man according to his works." And I got to thinking about that again. I was like, oh, he's talking about himself in the third person. And then there was an aha. And Mike even read it with me. And when he read it, he slammed the Bible shut. And he said, oh, he's talking about himself. And there he's talking about himself. That's how Mike said it. And I just grinned from ear to ear because, we know this gospel. And we know that even in Christianity, if you're a believer, then you are rewarded with Christ's life and with Christ's righteousness and all that. The only difference is we know that he rewarded every man. So, is he rewarding every man according to every man's works? It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Or did he reward every man according to his works? The scriptures aren't about you, they're about Jesus. Jesus wasn't even talking about you. He was talking about himself. And he did reward every man according to his works. It's just something to chew on. Thanks.